Hello, everyone. We are continuing here at Text of the Matter on Hegel and Marx and their relationships through their shared concept of the dialectic. This is continuing something that we were working on earlier in our final episode on Hegel. So I'm Misha.
I'm Egon, and welcome back, kiddos. You made it through. Um, you can
Oh,
see
all
the light.
those Hegelian kiddos, all those like
The young
weird
Hegelians.
dialectical
Yeah,
kiddos. Yeah.
I'm sure.
The youngest Hegelians, the baby Hegelians.
I think we can start to see though that there is, a revolutionary component to what Hegel is doing.
Absolutely.
And I think the historical context of when he's writing these things are often forgotten about, which is unfortunate because, I think this is why this is why, Hegel's on White Lives Matter t-shirt,
Hmm.
that Mos Def is wearing today, right? Like,
Yeah.
um, but I think Herbert Marcuse puts this into perspective really well in sort of the beginning of his book Reason and Revolution, and I'll note here too, for Marcuse, he always translates Geist, which is phenomenology of Geist in the German. He translates it to mind as opposed to spirit. We're normally uh, hearing phenomenology of spirit. Well, Marcuse, who's German, he translates to phenomenology of mind. So,
Mind, he translates to mind in English, which is this great kind of like fun complexity. I'm not sure exactly what he does in German, like what if that mean like what is the meaning of him using it in his natural language and how he learned it, because that's how it was titled at the time that he was alive, was
right.
phenomenology of the mind. That's what would have been sold. And um additionally, you could also point out, as I think you're suggesting, that there also is some latent meaning in his choice of words as a German person living in Berkeley, living in California.
Right,
um
right.
yeah.
And we can obviously argue over German, which we're not going to do because neither of us are fluent German speakers. So what the
Yeah.
hell was the point? But
Yes.
but there's a lot of that, and you see it on Twitter all the time. Most recently there was a whole thing about Aufheben, where it's it's Twitter, so it devolves to jokes basically. But what does that really mean? Because there's not really a good English translation of it.
Yeah.
It's sort of
The
sublation.
sublation, the approximate overcoming, which gets used in Nietzsche in a near opposite way, or if not opposite, opposing way.
Right.
Yeah.
But we
um
will sublate all of that discussion to to books and reading for right now. But in reason,
I just one note before you continue. I would
sure,
like to
yeah,
say what's really fascinating also, just as one more point about translation, is if you read any of the more recent books on historical materialism, in particular like Zizek's historical materialism book, he is constantly referring it to both phenomenology of spirit and phenomenology of mind, because he is now relating to it as two concrete forms: translation one, translation two, sometimes of the first book that Hegel wrote, and sometimes of the second, sometimes of the same book by different
hmm
translators. So it's fascinating that these two conceptual edifices are like, exist side by side for the same thinker, just in a title. But anyway,
and it's representative of how we interpret different philosophers. Like the way that Plato was interpreted in ancient Greece, I'm sure is a light years different than how he's interpreted now. And this is, and honestly, Hegel would argue that this is absolutely the dialectic, and that's how it's
yes.
supposed to work, right? Um, but to bring it back around in Reason and Revolution, Herbert Marcuse says this. He says Hegel wrote Hegel wrote the Phenomenology of Mind in 1806 in Jena, while the Napoleonic armies were approaching that city. He finished it as the Battle of Jena sealed the fate of Prussia and enthroned the heir of the French Revolution over the powerless remnants of the old German Reich. The feeling that a new epoch in world history had just begun pervades Hegel's book. And I bring this up not only because you can see the kind of revolutionary spirit that's involved in what Hegel's doing and how that could find its way to Marx and turn into an actual revolutionary substance. But that, you know, in Hegel's time, like and these are a lot of the things that I critique about Hegel and dislike. He is espousing the progressive view. You know, he is
Yes.
laying the groundwork for the republic nation state. You know, he is watching the French Revolution happen and seeing it as a vital expression, you know, of the dialectic through human history. And then, of course, the terror that follows is part and parcel to that. And so, you know, he sort of celebrates Napoleon in this sort of perverse way. But, you know, to him, this is the revolution. This is the bourgeois revolution. And I can't remember who
Well,
says it. I think it's Karl Korsch in his book, Marxism and Philosophy. But he reminds us that Hegel is the philosopher of the bourgeois revolution.
no,
Marx,
absolutely. No, I this is exactly how I was going to respond to you, was that in a sense you see how Marx's theory is formed quite directly by Hegel and his response philosophically, because for Marx there are two essential stages that we cannot escape the bourgeois revolution, that rather the bourgeois revolution is necessary. And when we say a bourgeois revolution, we're talking about, you know, the movement towards democratic standards, towards things like unions, towards industrialization. These were all parts of
and
bourgeois life.
individualism, you know,
Individualism,
and
absolutely.
subjectivity. You know, what is the bourgeois
The
subject but the city citizen, someone
absolutely.
who is working beyond just subsistence and the continuation of their family, you know, and
And like, for instance, a person who strongly rejected Hegel in many ways, Kierkegaard, always strikes me as this perfect, both in Marxian but also Hegelian, bourgeois subject, or this semi-aristocratic character looking for the loss that happens naturally in experience, and wishes to, instead of finding a dialectical transcendence, to find true repetition of the original experience, which always turns out to be impossible because he can't really get past his own individual experience. And he doesn't really understand Hegel in the writing. And
right.
you see this come so often in many of our most famous and most profound bourgeois modern philosophical thinkers. And in this way, you know, Hegel and Marx both kind of stand over them as like means of interpreting them, means of understanding their subjective and universal positions.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And so something that I've been using that I've found really helpful. So this dude Shlomo Avineri wrote this essay in 1967 called "The Hegelian Origins of Marxist Political Thought," and it's just really interesting because basically what he's mainly looking at is this 1843 writing of Marx called "The Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right."
Yeah.
And it's
And it should be noted that philosophy of right was Hegel's most clear and complete writing on politics, right?
yes,
Like
and
he most
also
directly, oh sorry.
oh, I'm just adding, and also one that is finds Hegel aging and becoming an old man and
Yes.
getting a little more reactionary in his interpretations of what a state should be and how it should function, specifically responding to the massive instability of the German state, which, you know, exists from fucking, you know, as he's
but
writing philosophy of right up until the end of World War II, basically.
but also his more abstract connection to Plato and the
Yes.
kind of somewhat proto-fascistic, which I wouldn't call Hegel fascistic, just liberal in some of the worst ways.
Yeah. Yeah.
But there being that continuity of the kind of the shaping of the mind of the state and that kind of special person that he imagined as being the force for that. But go on with this essay. I have not heard of this essay.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting. And so like I said, it's talking about this critique that Marx did of philosophy of right. And this critique is it's strangely academic for Marx. It's like, here's what Hegel says, and then Marx writes like fucking 30 pages on it.
Mm-hmm.
But what Shlomo is claiming is that he's using or he's being influenced by Feuerbach's work called Provisional Thesis for the Reformation of Philosophy.
Yeah.
In that work, Feuerbach is using Hegel as an interlocutor. And this is Shlomo's sort of paraphrasing of Feuerbach's theses. And he says, Hegelian philosophy is a, quote, mystification because it perverts the subject-predicate relationship. By a transformative reading of Hegel that will substitute predicate for subject and vice versa, one can arrive at a philosophy that is adequate to reality. Man, who in Hegel's system is a predicate of spirit, will thus be transformed again into a subject, whereas spirit will become what it has always been, a predicate of man. And, for me, I don't necessarily agree with Feuerbach, but the point is, in this sort of reversing the subject predicate relationship of spirit and man, you can see how Marx can take an idealism and turn it into a materialism, right? That he is
Certainly.
sort of, to use Zizek in a way, sort of reading Hegel against the grain, where he agrees with what sort of Hegel is proposing and the concepts that he's bringing forth, but he's recognizing the split in Hegel's thinking of the authoritative state and the nobility of that with what is actually happening in society and what that actually looks like and how that is not, is essentially what Hegel is claiming it to be, right?
I find this quite interesting because Lukács talks about this relationship with Feuerbach as well in the beginning of his book, and he talks about Marx's warning of treating Hegel as a dead dog, right? As like this fixed systematic order to be consumed. But at the same time, he also talks about Hegel not being a dead dog, right? As being something that is alive, and of complaining that Feuerbach did not have the luck of having truly understood Hegel, right? That and you can see in that way an evolution of Marx's thought from those early papers, because by the end it isn't just a simple reversal of Hegel, right? It's a more complex and interactive analysis, because as we talked about at the end of the text, and is confrontation with the idea of alienation of culture. Yes, there's a degree of reversal, but culture still remains this alienated body in Marx. Right. Maybe the affirmation of it changes, right? But it is something that is taken from Hegel and put into Marx into a materialist system, and the context changes its meaning, but the concept itself remains relatively untouched.
Well, yeah, I always like to look at Marx. It's like an application of Hegelianism, right?
Yes.
And you can see this in some of Marx's most like fundamental concepts, in that, he is attributing alienation to the bifurcation of the individual between the bourgeois subject and
Yes.
the citizen, which is exactly what Hegel is talking about. You know, Hegel is taking this sort of bourgeois subject, the individual, and saying, no, you must also be the citizen. You must universalize your experience in order to contend or to meet with the absolute.
as,
And
as well as the estrangement of the individual from their labor time, and their labor time as this collective participation. So then the universal is broken from the particular, or in this case, the individual human being, right? So
right, and of
continuing
course
with the
this
trend.
is straight from Hegel as well too, where it's like, he's, we sort of talked about this a little bit in the Master and Bondsman episode we did, but the way that Hegel sees work is it's fundamental to the dialectical process, because it is part of what turns the object to part of the subject. When we make something, when we make an object, it is not just an object, a noumenon, so to speak,
Yeah.
for itself, but it is also part of us. And it's fundamental to Hegelianism that this work, this activity, is how this whole process functions, and how one can internalize the object, which is already internal to us, but appears as separate, right? And this is Hegel trying to solve Kant's problem of the antinomies, right?
Well, I think this leads into another interesting quote from Reason and Revolution by
Mm-hmm.
Marcuse, in which he's talking about phenomenology of the mind in particular. And he says, the dialectical system alters the structure and meaning of the proposition and makes it something quite different from the proposition of traditional logic. The latter logic, to which Hegel alludes as the logic of common sense, meaning the logic of traditional scientific method as well, treats propositions as consisting of a subject, which serves as a fixed and stable base and a predicate attached to it. The predicates are the accidental properties, or in Hegel's language, determinations of a more or less fixed substance. As a contrast to this view of proposition, Hegel sets the speculative judgment in philosophy. The speculative judgment does not have a stable and passive subject. Its subject is active and develops itself in its predicates. The predicates are various forms of the subject's existence, or to state it somewhat differently, what happens is that the subject goes under and turns into the predicate. So this is returning to what you were talking about in Marx's earliest references to Feuerbach. But Lukács adds another element where he says, beyond this transformation into the predicate, where Hegel becomes limited isn't so much this relation between subject and predicate, what is the subject and what is the predicate, but rather, what is it that makes up the predicate? Is it something like Hegel's statement that East is also West, right? These stable forms, conceptual forms, or do they become forces? As Hegel himself describes as a possibility, do they become actual movements of people, of historical forces, of violence, of war, of economic motivations, of industrial revolution, right?
Right.
That no longer can it simply be conceptual abstraction versus another conceptual concretization, but rather these real things that are multiple in and of themselves, right? And this is where Marx's system as a whole is fundamentally better. But interestingly enough, when we look at people like Adorno or Marcuse, I would say they are far more Hegelian than Lukács. And Lukács is an extremely Hegelian Marxist for his time. And as things go on, Hegel becomes more and more powerful over this. So as we look into Marx going into our next episode, and we start getting into those concepts such as alienation and commodity fetish, into the way that he uses the dialectic to set up these very substantial categories in the economy and in history, that there are all these forces going on around him, a long lineage of philosophy born of his thinking, a long political line that bore multiple actual states, his own political activity that transformed Parisian politics forever,
Yeah.
right? As Badiou would call it, the strong singularity of the Paris Commune, right? So there's all of these floating signifiers, but also concrete material elements, dialectical elements that are at play when we go into Marx. And
Yes.
we should be reminded of them before we fully venture in.
Yeah, and to remind ourselves of how close Marx was to Hegel's time. There was overlap there. You know what I mean? And that's important to realize. And I think is going to be really instrumental when we move to Marx and start reading him, to remember that this is something that was part of his upbringing, part of his education, and that I did mention this like sort of oddball text by Marx early on in his career in 1843. But Marx also never goes out and just refutes Hegel. He might critique him, but he never refutes him.
Certainly.
And whether it's Lukács or Adorno, that dialectical strand passes through Marx and is important to the reinterpretation of communism and socialism after World War II, and it's very fascinating, I think. And
and ultimately I think what the work will be going on, continuing the project that we've worked on so far and that you all have been joining us in, is to really see what it means to participate in a dialectical analysis of society, how Hegel and his ideas participate in this work, and how Marx's ideas do, and to kind of work out why these various points on the continuum of synthesis between the two thinkers and what they take and what they leave behind, what this means about the idea of socialism, of Marxism, of communism as both heterogeneous and single particular things. How that process makes the political future, right?
Yes.
And how we can construct it through deep and rigorous work with these thinkers.
Yeah, and to also acknowledge that there's a wake that these thinkers leave behind. I mean, I think one of the most frustrating things about reading Hegel, beyond just the reading of Hegel, which I joke. I mean, Hegel can be really fun, but it's it's difficult reading. It can be difficult going, but the frustrating thing about reading him is how fucking often he's right, or like has a premonition of the world that we live in, and I think that should give us some credence to not only analyze what Hegel's thinking, but give credence to how he influenced Marx, who obviously had a huge impact on the world, So
and if we are to throw away Hegel, we are throwing away Marx, right?
Yeah, totally.
We are not taking Marx seriously, because Hegel is not a dead dog. He is a living dog, and we need to pet him and give him hugs and all the care that a good dog needs.
Needs a good bath.
Yeah, we don't want an angry dog covered in fleas,
So
lashing out like Kanye West or whatever.
Talk about a dog that needs a bath.
Yeah.
And Kim's like, no.
Yeah. Though I heard some good wisdom today. Yeah, I've talked about him enough, and so in that regard, I feel like I'm going to talk about him one more time. and
And then
then
that's
and
it.
that's gonna be it. That's
That's
gonna
gonna
be
be
it.
it.
And becoming soon to Text of the Matter. But anyway,
So it's funny, this conversation made me think of something, and you know, it's kind of a stupid hot take, but I would love to still hear your reaction to it. You know, so we're talking about this system that Hegel has set forth about this sort of making the individual universal and this through this process of dialectics. And you know, and speaking of like sometimes the most frustrating thing about Hegel is like where he's right or has these kind of like glimpses of the future.
mhm.
And I freak out sometimes where it's like, man, is he just talking about the singularity? Like, is he talking about like us all being computers and thus finally being like, you know, the many that is one that is also the many, you know, but that's like indistinguishable from itself. Like, you know, like,
Well, what I think is that, and where Marx really gets the transformation, is that many of the things that Hegel was describing as being kind of like this synthetic and fluid process of individual and universal moving between each other to realize this whole is actually a violent process of not just conceptual and psychological conflict or historical change that leaves remnants of that struggle, but a constant battle for where what can come next, that actual synthesis will be so radically different from what we imagine,
mm-hmm,
right?
mm-hmm,
That um trying to describe it is somewhat difficult, right? Marx's utopia of the communist state isn't described in the same way as the state in Hegel, right? Which is so clear for Hegel. Marx is more trying to lay out the fundamental movement from this bourgeois revolution to the socialist revolution. And then similarly, we will get into the way when it happens practically with the Russians, it turns from this movement from the bourgeois to the socialist revolution or communist revolution to the socialist revolution to the communist revolution, where they're in this sort of partial socialism that becomes hypostasized in Stalin and faked into real communism and never really gets there. It's a
right.
stage that is always out there. We're always working toward it, but we can't realize it. So yeah, it's amazing how he predicts forms, but at the same time, it's unsurprising that there was a necessary political response from the left to his work, because it could not sustain itself. It required this um being hinged to the earth, you know.
Well, and you know, I think that's really the greatest way you can describe Hegel's work, really, is or at least dialectics, is that, you know, it's not that you have two contradictions or two things that are opposed to each other and that they are somehow integrated to make progress. But in conceiving of a contradiction as a whole, it essentially is in being able to conceive of a contradiction as non-contradictory necessarily produces something new, a
Yes.
new point of which we must embark from and unite the antinomies inherent to that, that were not the same antinomies inherent to what came before. And that, you know, that sublation is that both of those contradictions are destroyed and they become
Yes.
something else.
Something richer.
Mm-hmm.
And all I can finally say about it is I hope that it's clear that like some of the like neoliberal qualities that came out of Hegel, Fukuyama's End of History, that it's clear that that is not what the absolute is. That what the absolute for Hegel, right or wrong, whatever that would mean in this context, is something complex and moving, and that movement leads to somewhere equally rich and powerful, and that even that, while I ultimately disagree with Lukács that Marx isn't just some settled point of like absolute opening to the right way of thinking about things, that we need these moments, we need these elements, whether they're old white guys or not, and that, like, you know, only through reflection upon them can we sublate them,
Yeah. I mean, I
can we
couldn't have
get
said it
past them.
better. You know, I mean, it's like if we want a war, if we want a world, not a war, if we want a world
A
that,
nice bit of Freudian slip parapraxis right
yeah,
there.
but that is truly beyond, you know, this sort of patriarchal, hegemonic, white centric world that we've inherited. You know, we have to move through these thinkers that, you know, or at least if we do believe Hegel, that the conditions to move past that world is inherent, intrinsic to that world itself.
Yeah.
And so, while maybe not the sexiest thing in looking through these thinkers, we actually get a portal to the new world, that we get tools to build that new world. So
Yeah, I think that's actually a great way to conclude this episode. So this is our final bit on Hegel. If you go back a couple episodes, you can follow through all of our work on Hegel and on dialectics, and take the whole ride, or you can just start here and go on to what we'll be doing next week, where we'll really be digging into Marx and little elements of some of the theorists we've already referred to, as well as some of the people who followed him and worked on his project in a very concrete way. And yeah, I think you know, this was a ton of fun, and I'm really glad that we did it. It's fulfilling to have gone through this process of Kant and Hegel, as difficult as they are, and now we're starting to see, you know, some practical results, and it's invigorating to see how that played out in a continuous way, in a meaningfully continuous way, when we often, it's hard to find those type of continuities, intellectual continuities now.
we're into the light of modernity, baby.
Yeah.
Um,
So
yeah,
great.
but thank you all for tuning in. We've got a Patreon that if you join, we've got little goodies. We got little stickers, little stickies, and there'll be some other fun stuff there as well. And it just, you know, helps. Every little support helps. And yeah, join us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, whatever your kink is, and we'll see you guys next time.
Yeah, communicate, say what's up. It's great to be with you. Bye
And
from Kiss to the
please
Matter.
jump in the comments and fucking compliment that shirt that Misha is wearing. It looks like the texture of a towel. It looks so
it sort of
fly.
is. It sort of is like a towel.
It's so fly.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Summer's not dead, baby.
All right.
Cool.
Love you guys.
Bye.
Bye.